Michael Shellenberger joins us now. You can check him out, by the way. His books are San Francisco and Apocalypse Never. His Substack is public, where I've just spent some time talking about how indispensable, though, that work that you've been doing, Michael, along with Matt Taibbi over the past 12 months, and really putting the focus back on free speech in America. You know, man, I was just talking about the importance of a southern border in many of the, practical ways, but also philosophical ways, Michael. I mean, the practical effect is the crisis that we've seen across the nation. You saw some of it first in San Francisco, but all over the nation when it comes to fentanyl. But on a philosophical level as well, like, what is the idea of a nation state? Does the United States have an identifiable and maintainable culture? But there's clearly a thought process out there, Michael, represented perhaps most notably now because of Davos with the World Economic Forum, that sees a more utopic vision for the world that seemingly, Michael, rejects the idea of the nation state.
Yeah. Hey, Will, it's good to be with you again. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I think there's basically two competing visions. I mean, one is of civilization as we've had it for, thousands of years, really, and the particular form of liberal democracy that we pioneered in the United States. And it's not that complicated, really. I mean, you do have to have borders that function. You have to have law and order, meritocracy, cheap energy. And if you want it to be a democracy, you need free speech. You need to have elections. So in some ways, it's so simple. But yeah, I think there's been this challenging paradigm which says really no decisions are best made at the global level. It's best made at the United Nations or the World Economic Forum or the World Health Organization or UNESCO or you name it, many other global organizations. What's interesting, and you notice this, it's really important to elites that they be able to move people around the world. This is extremely important to elites in Europe. It's important in the United States. They are very focused on censoring and spreading their own disinformation around this issue, suggesting that's not a problem. It's now gone to the point where obviously it is a huge problem, but demonizing anybody that raises concerns around the importation of large numbers of unskilled workers, which obviously dampens wages for working people, sort of dismissing all those concerns as racist. We were looking at how there's just a small number of messages that elites use to basically disparage and demonize their opponents. And they're very interesting. It's basically that they're racists, that they're fascists, that they're somehow connected to Russia. And you might think, well, those are, all things that they think are true. But it's notable that they also, they don't say things like, oh, it's economically inefficient. That was an argument that was used in Brexit briefly. But even in Brexit, the focus was on Russia. So you see there's a very intense focus to kind of frame populists, nationalists. Mostly that's people on the right, but it is not necessarily that. But what we've documented and where we've come to after a year of this now is really that what you're seeing is elites engaged in counter-populism, and they're using the same tactics and tools that they developed in the war on terrorism. And this is why it's been so confusing in terms of left and right, because we associate the war on terrorism, at least initially, with George W. Bush. Of course, it was heavily prosecuted by Obama. But you get to the end of the Obama administration, you get to Trump, Brexit in 2016 and Trump's election, and you see elites start to turn these counter-terrorist tools into counter-populist tools.
Mike, we throw that word around. I use the word a lot. You've used it numerous times in your answer to me just now. Elites. Who are the elites?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make it, I'm not trying to be super fancy with it. I just mean, college-educated people that tend to work in journalism. They tend to be, we sometimes say, professional managerial class. That's a concept that was developed by James Burnham to describe how, as capitalism becomes more complex, particularly after World War II, you have all these different agencies. I mean, there's actually, so many government agencies that many people don't even know of or have even heard of. So you have this huge class of educated people that work in, NGOs and media, in journalism, in government, in corporations. The idea used to be that corporations were where the conservatives and Republicans were. We've seen even that's changed, right? Mm-hmm. Where the corporations are the one that are pushing a pretty radical trans agenda, pushing, a pretty radical climate agenda, Black Lives Matter, and really sort of moralizing a new morality, a new, what you might call a new woke morality on the whole population. So that's who I mean by elites.
But what do you think, Mike, is the through line? There was a time when we would have used that term probably to stratify a country economically. So the elites would be presumed to be the wealthier side of society. But I'm not sure wealth does the job of describing elites. Many people have written about this. Is it education level? Is it worldview? Is it a mindset? By the way, it's also sort of international. It's not defined by necessarily American colleges or American elites. There's a commonality. And I'm not rejecting the existence of elites, Mike. I'm definitely not. I believe as well with you that there is a small group of people defining what is acceptable, what's acceptable to see, what's acceptable to think, what's acceptable to read, even to some extent what's acceptable to eat. But I'm not sure what defines them. What's a through line of who makes up the elite?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Will. I think it's, really, if you go from World War II until, let's say, 2016, with this populist revolution, both political parties, left and right, but also you saw in Europe, had elites, and then, educated, affluent elites, and then working folks. What really happens after 2016 is that it starts to split by party. So you start to see, the elites really kind of moving more to the left. So you see the Never Trump Republicans, who I would say are more professional managerial class elites, becoming more Democrat. Many of the folks that had been Democrats that were more working class, and even some that are sort of anti-interventionist, anti-imperialist left-wing people like Matt Taibbi, like Glenn Greenwald, like my colleagues at Public, and to some extent myself, because that was my history as well. You sort of see, we start to sympathize more with the anti-interventionism of nationalism and populism. So you start to see that. Now, I guess, to some extent, you're always going to have leaders, and you're always going to have folks that are educated and providing some of that leadership. But I think maybe the better way to think of it is that really the professional managerial class ends up on the left much more strongly than I think it did before 2016.
Mike, I am fascinated by guys like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi and yourself, who were, I can't speak to you, and Matt and I have had our own conversations, and I've talked to Glenn as well, who weren't just men of the left, but were reliable, celebrated. I do not think they would have even been self-described as centrist left prior to the last 5 some odd years. And again, I'm not as familiar with your entire resume, Mike, in terms of where your ideological bent has been throughout your career. But I do think it's fair to say you were probably, and you just said to us, probably someone who would have been self-described on the left. What is it that's changed? Like, for them, for you, why are you now seeing yourself distinct from whatever's happening to the left?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, all of us have slightly different trajectories. I think Glenn and Matt are probably a little bit more similar. I was already becoming more moderate around environmental issues because I supported things like fracking and nuclear power. On homelessness, I support mandating psychiatric care and rehab to people who break the law as an alternative to jail, as opposed to the much more libertarian, radical left policies of the West Coast, and that's what San Francisco's about. But I've always been very skeptical and critical of U.S. military interventions abroad. I was against the invasion of Iraq, against the long-term occupation of Afghanistan. Many of those other interventions I've been opposed to. Not always opposed, not knee-jerk, but certainly skeptical of those interventions. So I think all of those things participated in it. I think all of us, and this would go also, I think, for Elon Musk and many of the rest of us that are more Gen X left, was that really we do not like wokeism. We don't like I just had a conversation about this. I think a lot of millennials don't know what it was like in the 80s and 90s. In the 80s and 90s, and I don't want to overly romanticize it, but I mean, there was more of a sense of which all that race stuff, the boomers dealt with that. Now you can date people from different colors and you go to different parties and you hang out, and it's kind of that the baggage, there's probably still baggage there, but it wasn't anywhere as intense as it was in the 60s. You get to like the 2000s and even before the rise of social media, but the rise of social media, you sort of see it all come back around race and sex. And you're like, really, are we really going to then go and like, we're going to go do this again? I mean, I thought we did that in the late 60s and it ended badly. So I think a bunch of us got turned off by that.
Yeah.
I genuinely think that is why Elon bought Twitter. It was, people will say it was restore Babylon B. I think it's kind of it's a useful metaphor. I think it was really like, it's a toxic environment where somehow it was, bad to be white, bad to be heterosexual, bad to be American. It was a very just a very negative discourse. I think we all know what we're talking about. So I think a lot of us were turned off to that because it's not liberal. It's not actually what we meant by liberal anyway. I know that it's what people call liberal, but it's actually quite illiberal. And this idea of silencing people, there's something wrong with you psychologically if you want to make other people shut up. I mean, you can ignore people. So this desire to censor, to deplatform, to cancel, it comes from a bad place psychologically that I think that, earlier in the Gen X period, I think we had a more, properly liberal view, which was like, hey, that's your thing. I don't agree, but, let's just kind of be more chill about it.
I think the woke left's response to you would be you lived in a dream reality. Their response would be whatever you perceived to be the 80s and the 90s was from the perspective of a white man, and you didn't see or acknowledge the problems that existed underneath your nose. I'm Gen X as well. I happen to think you're correct. I would never suggest we were arriving at racial utopia and racism had gone the way of the dinosaurs. But I do believe, looked to make that not our defining characteristic. And I think the polling, by the way, backs up our perception of reality. If you see race relation polls over time, in the mid 2000s, so 03 or so, was its nadir. It was the lowest. It was the highest racial harmony. And then it's a correlation, but it's worthy of exploration with Barack Obama around his presidency. It begins to rise, which is wild because it should have been the celebration of a moment. Forget ideology for a moment or parties or partisanship. Just a moment for America to say we have started to really overcome. But instead, it began more to divide. I do want to ask you this, Mike. I talked about this yesterday here on the Will Cain Show. Many of the things you talk about, your evolution, it's not simply your evolution or Matt's or Glenn's. It's also the evolution of the Republican Party. And that non-interventionist strain of the Republican Party, the populism of concern, and I'm going to put it in the realm of concern. It always needs to be pressed for action, but for the middle class or for the downtrodden in the Republican Party has been a movement to go in that direction for the GOP. And I am concerned. I'm curious. I don't know if you would ever self-describe yourself now on the right or vote Republican, but, that has also correlated to the rise of Donald Trump. And I'm curious, without Donald Trump, if the Republican Party returns to sort of its baseline of decades of a little more callous to the populist plight of the middle class and lower middle class, and a little more interested in military adventurism. I am concerned of who keeps this direction, if not after Donald Trump, for the GOP.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. And I've actually my heart has been warmed by the concern on the part of a lot of Republicans and conservatives that Nikki Haley might win and that she would bring back neocons and that would return to republicanism. I share that concern. I've certainly seen Glenn has been going after Nikki Haley, Rand Paul. These are all people that I respect a great deal. So I've been really happy to see that. It seems like, assuming Trump wins the nomination, then it seems like the party will be firmly a party of populism and nationalism and of the working class. And the Nikki Haley folks will just become Democrats. I think that's a healthy trajectory. I support that. Personally, I'm in my reporter mode now. I mean, you may know I ran for governor in 2022 and it didn't work out. And so I'm really a journalist. I really am enjoying it. And I've really decided to be independent, which I am. I'm politically independent. I may not vote for a presidential candidate. So I'm a little old fashioned in the sense that I really am enjoying the independent status I have. I have concerns around Trump. You know, there's things that he says, just this thing, you know, of like, I'd be dictator for a day. You know, I know what he means. I don't find it helpful. You know, it's concerning. Like basically, all my friends and all my family, the friends I still have, you know, it's triggering. It's concerning, and especially when we've been documenting abuses of power by the Democrats, censorship, abuses of power by the FBI. I mean, this latest thing, the January 6th bomb was a hoax, and that the FBI and the Secret Service are implicated in it. I mean, these are really serious potential abuses of power that are not being properly investigated. It's been partisan. I'm very concerned about that. I think it's hard to make the arguments that Democrats have become more authoritarian, and you even see totalitarian impulses and this desire to silence people. It's much harder to make that when you have Republicans also demanding for censorship in some ways or saying things like that. So anyway, that's my little thing on it. I know people will object, but I tend to just enjoy my independent status, and will maintain that for the next, you know, for past the 2024 elections.
Well, I think it's fair to say Democrats are willing to destroy democracy in the pursuit of saving democracy. Yes. That they feel Donald Trump represents some type of authoritarianism, and in order to counterbalance that authoritarianism, to defeat that authoritarianism, they will fully embrace authoritarianism. They will embrace all the trappings of it, as you mentioned, censorship, dictates, lockdown, whatever it may be, will be embraced in order to, in their minds, push back on authoritarianism. And for your family, I think the thing, on a shallow level, it's just always about Donald Trump's personality. But then if you just dig one level deeper, it's a question of, do you take him literally or do you take him seriously? And I think too many people take him literally while not taking him seriously. They think he's a clown show, and yet at the same time think he will be a dictator because he says, I'll be dictator for a day. Where the other side says he doesn't mean it. He doesn't want to be a dictator, but he takes the things he wants to accomplish very seriously. I want to push forward, Mike. There's something I've always wanted to talk to you about. You wrote about this. You brought up it a minute ago, homelessness. You know, the homelessness thing, to me, we all probably listening also have some personal experience with severe mental illness. There's just a direct correlation. And I'm not here to tell you which one is more moral, but there's a direct correlation between the shutdown of institutions in the United States and the rise in mental illness on the streets of America. Homelessness and mental illness are very, very overlapped. And what is it now, Mike? Probably 40 years ago, the shutdown of involuntary commitment in institutions was a movement in the 70s, I believe. When that happened, we saw the rise of mental illness and homelessness. And I don't think it's a good thing to take people's freedom away, meaning involuntary commitment. But the problem is those that are sick don't commit themselves. So I don't know what you do here, Mike, but I do think these two issues are tied together. No more institutions. Now we have homelessness.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I still get emotional about this issue, even though I've been working on it for so long. It's very hard to see, particularly, women in psychotic states, particularly women, but men too, but young women, half naked in psychotic states, knowing they've been sexually assaulted on the streets. I've seen women with hospital bands still on their wrists. Clearly should be getting care in a hospital, and everybody that, all of the social workers and, homeless service providers in the area know that they should be in hospital, and they're not. And so clearly, we shut down the hospitals. Some of the, it's not exact, we call it deinstitutionalization, but in some ways it was just reinstitutionalization. We took people out of mental hospitals. They ended up in prisons and jails, or they ended up in the streets. You can do residential care. My aunt had schizophrenia. She had residential care. She was in a group home. That's what that is, what we call boarding care in California. But you still often need to have some sort of court order so that she can't go and live in a homeless encampment, that there's some way to require that they come inside. or it's also called conservatorship in California. Or, we also have something called assisted outpatient treatment. That's a fancy way of saying some court order for people. Look, we all love our freedom. None of us would want to be involuntarily, sent to a hospital if we're sane. At the same time, if I have a psychotic break, and I think that, whatever, that I should be naked and living on the streets, and that's fine. I hope somebody would stop me from doing that so that I don't end up being, badly abused like so many people on the street are. So I think we all want those two things. There's been there's a movement on the radical left since the 60s that's really demonized psychiatry. Sort of see it show up in these movies, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I do think we're now seeing a move back. I saw Vivek Ramaswamy say we need to bring back the psychiatric hospitals. I just did an interview. It's a big book by a New York University sociologist, young, very, very left, very liberal, very strong liberal credentials. Him also making the case for expanded conservatorship of people with mental illness. His brother is mentally ill, and we all know what happens to people on the street. So I do hope we're coming back to a better place for that. I think that the bipartisan potential is that you have a proper psychiatric and addiction care system, much more similar to what other developed countries have, combined with expanded efforts to get people the care they need. There's always going to be a judge involved, so it's not like this is just psychiatrists gone wild. But I think that's the holy grail.
Wait, help me reconcile something. You said there's been a demonization of psychiatry on the left, but that comes at the same time that we've seen a massive spike in diagnoses. Everything now seems to have a clinical diagnosis instead of, hey man, now I'm not diminishing depression, right? But hey, you're sad or you're having a bad time. Instead, we've moved towards a diagnosis. You have a specific condition, and there's a medicine for that. That has definitely been on the rise. And I mean, the numbers, Mike, on the people who are on antidepressants or ADHD drugs, it's stunning. I mean, like the percentage of America, and by the way, America, way more than the rest of the world. The percentage of our population on psychiatric medicine it would blow your mind. So help me rationalize that with what you said. There's been an effort to demonize psychiatrics.
Yeah, great question. And by the way, I totally agree with you. It's I just saw this great little, I think it was like a TikTok or Instagram video where somebody was complaining about being blue or depressed or something, and their friend was like, have you exercised today? Have you eaten right? Did you get enough sleep? Did you get enough sunlight?
Yeah.
We now know I'm doing daylight because I have some amount of seasonal affective disorder. I benefit enormously. I have this little daylight that I have put on in the morning. I run in the morning. So there's just a lot of things that we can do for optimal mental health that people aren't doing and that we're not encouraging. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that there's I think the way you explain it is that the way that the anti-psychiatry movement manifested itself was really around victimhood ideology. So people with serious mental illness were viewed as victims, and to victims, nothing should be taken, everything should be given, and no requirements that they come inside or whatnot. For the folks that we're talking about, the folks that have much more like psychiatric disorders, which are curable, serious mental illness like schizophrenia, bipolar, and depression are viewed as things that are kind of lifelong. And they're treatable, but it's not like psychiatric disorders like anxiety, depression, right, OCD, ADHD. These things are highly treatable and often without drugs at all, right? Just diet and exercise and community and having purpose in your life. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that this is these are in some ways iatrogenic psychiatric disorders, meaning that they're caused by the system, by the healthcare system, which has drugs to sell. And as you have the drugs emerge, then you have many more diagnoses. So yeah, I completely agree with you. I think both things are true. It's that we have too many seriously mentally ill people that need to be required to come inside and get the care that they need so they don't destroy themselves and hurt others. And you also have people that are being overdiagnosed that just need purpose in their life, exercise in the morning, enough sunlight, proper sleep. Probably quit drinking alcohol. No drugs or alcohol is always a good policy for people. So I think there's just a lot. I think both things are true.
All right. I want to end here. I want you to help me to understand, now that we've defined the elite, I want you to help me understand the mindset of the elite, maybe the World Economic Forum. We started today's show talking about the existence of a nation state and culture and the necessity of a border. I'm glad you brought up Europe, by the way. In so many ways, Europe is the canary in the coal mine on a unfettered migration of people across the globe. I also am glad you brought up the working class and the constant rebuttal that any opposition to illegal immigration is racism, because we see, by the way, in liberal cities, many, for example, black community leaders saying this is having a negative effect on not just our wages, but our jobs. And, we're suffering from the unemployment effects of illegal immigration. So what is the mindset of the guys sitting at Davos? What is the mindset of the World Economic Forum, of the liberal elite? And as someone who came from the left, I mean, is it a belief in a utopia that if just given enough power can be engineered, that people are pawns and the smartest can create a new society? Like, I'm curious, and whoever that may be, Klaus Schwab, if Klaus Schwab and I were talking and we sat down and I'm like, Klaus, what is it you want? Like, what is your vision of the world? What do you think it is, Mike?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and they're a fascinating group of people. So there's just a lot going on. I mean, on the one hand, these are very empowered people. They're affluent. They have a lot of power. They're used to having a lot of power. On the other hand, I think they're very anxious about losing their power. They're anxious particularly about populist movements. They're anxious that they're not going to be able to exercise control across borders. They're not going to be able to have military interventions when they want to have them. They're not going to be able to control energy supplies. They've been in an alliance for over 50 years with interests that want to keep energy scarce. Energy is basically very abundant, particularly natural gas and nuclear are just infinite effectively. And so that's a problem. So you have energy interests that's a problem because then the prices are too low. So you have energy interests that ally with this Malthusian, anti-human, pro-scarcity agenda. That's often the financial bread and butter of those elite efforts. And then you have the populism, which I think absolutely terrifies them. They worry they're not going to have the control they need. They want to be able to move. You want to be able to invade countries and then end up having refugee and migration crises as a result. And you got to be able to move people around the world. They're terrified that they're not going to be able to do that. You see it in Europe, you see it in the United States, you see in Ireland, all these different countries struggling with integrating all these migrants. You see in the United States, very progressive, as you mentioned, Chicago, New York, California. I mean, you see very progressive states that are like, our social. I think there was a bunch of mayors, by the way, that yesterday sent a letter saying they're overwhelmed. The social services are overwhelmed. So you start to get the contradictions of this elite ideology where you can't just move people around the world. You end up with problems of assimilation, but also your systems are overwhelmed. So, I mean, look, we're in a period of massive change. I think you're going to see a huge political victories for the right in the United States and around the world, not just this year, but I would say in several election cycles. I think the left is going to have to respond to that. I do think you're going to see a reversion towards nationalism, not complete, but much stronger control over borders, because it's obviously gotten out of control. The public understands that. They know now that it's not racist. When you have black progressive mayors of Chicago saying they can't handle all these people, that's not racism. That's just being practical. So I think that a lot of the older ways of demonizing the populist nationalist right are going to diminish in power. And I think the right's going to have to be disciplined. And we've seen some of that from Trump being, with the exception of the thing I mentioned, the dictator for day. I think you did see some more discipline out of Trump. In fact, he tried to clean that up. So it does seem like we're in for a period of change. It's exciting to watch. I hope that it results in more civilization and more liberal democracy, and not some sort of a reversion towards authoritarianism, because it does seem like we're really on a razor's edge between those two potential futures.
Well, he's doing important work in championing free speech and pushing back on institutions bent towards authoritarianism. You should subscribe, follow him at the Public Substack, or check out either of his books, San Francisco or Apocalypse Never. And I always enjoy the conversation. Thank you so much, Michael Shellenberger.
Me too. Thanks, Will.